This is a Lego brick, and if you've ever stepped on one, you'll know how much it hurts. But I wanted to take this to the extreme. I wanted to turn mere bricks into a fully functioning sword. I ended up making this, and then I tested it. But before we get to that, I need to build it. I went and dug out an old tub of Lego, and it was time to get building. At this stage, I wasn't worried about colours. I just wanted to test designs, and I'll order the correct bricks later, once I know what works. I began with the handle because honestly I had no idea where to start. I just wanted to have a solid grip. So I grabbed a few tires and turned them inside out. Flipping them this way makes a cool design and gives it some grip. But the handle was a little bit too small. I needed more space so I could have a second hand. And so I thought may as well use the rims from the tires, which fit perfectly. Next up was the cross guard. I started with a simple flat line, but it looked too plain. So I added some sloped pieces to each end to give it a little bit more character. I tried a bunch of different designs before finally landing on one that looked right. Once I was happy with it, I mirrored it on the other side. Technically the handle wasn't finished, since I still need to make a counterweight, but I decided to figure that one out later. For now, I'm just going to move on to start making the blade and building the handle in the proper colours. So I ordered a bunch of bricks, enough for the handle and the blade, and remade the handle in its correct colours, and this looks way better. Okay, let's move on to the blade. So this is the blade of a sword, but the most important part is not actually its sharp edge, it's something called the tang. A tang pretty much is the spine of the sword. It's what gives the blade strength and stops it from snapping when you swing it. So that's what I gotta make first. To make a strong tang, I built these pillars, but on their own, they weren't nearly as strong as they needed to be. By simply adding a rod through the middle of each piece, it makes it way stronger. At least in theory, it won't snap. I mean, it is still Lego. So I repeated the process until it matched the length of the blade that I wanted. But then I hit a massive problem. The tang wouldn't even hold its own weight, let alone support a blade while it's being swung. That's something we have to fix, but I was kind of out of ideas, so I wanted to move on to something I actually knew what I was doing, and that's the sharp edge itself. For the blade, I used Lego plates. These pieces don't just add support and strength, but they're also thin enough that I'll be able to sharpen them later on. Here's a small segment to show you how it works. The plan was to build both sides of the blade, leaving the center empty so I could sandwich the tang later on. Now I just need to scale it up into two fully sized pieces. To make it less boring, I added a layer of dark grey plate. On one side, I also added an extra layer of plating. These will be the plates I sharpen later on. Once I finished the first one, I got started on the second one until they were both at the same stage. The next step was putting the blade ends together. On one end it needed to stay flat so we could connect cleanly to the handle, and on the other I had to shape it to a proper point like a sword. This was probably the hardest part of the whole build. I had to make it look right while still keeping it strong. I also wanted to use the right type of Lego bricks so it looked clean and not jagged. What do you guys think? Did I pull it off? Let me know in the comments. Once the blade was finished, I put all the pieces together to see how the sword would look. The only thing missing was the counterweight, and honestly, I had no idea how to do it. That's why I was putting it off till later. And I'm going to keep doing that, because now we're going back to the tang. In small segments, the tang worked fine. It was strong, but once everything was put together, the rods failed. Since the Lego rods didn't run all the way through the sword, there were gaps in between each rod, and that's where it was weak. To fix this, I decided to make new rods out of steel wire. Unfortunately, that means the sword won't be 100% Lego, but it's still as close to it as I can get. By adding 1 or 2 rods through the center and 4 more around the outside where the gaps are in the bricks, the tang should be more than strong enough to hold. So I cut a bunch of steel rods to the full length of the sword. The only problem was they came out really bendy and uneven. To straighten them, I put a loop in the ends with some pliers, stuck them into my drill and held the other end tight, spinning the drill, pulling the wire straight. This usually works better with smaller wire, but it still worked here. I made a few extra just in case and they were ready to be used. Lego on its own isn't sharp, and it doesn't stay together permanently. So the next steps were to sharpen the bricks and then glue them in place. To start, I took the bottom layer off one of the sides, the side with the extra bricks. Starting with the electric sander, I removed most of the material. Once it had a good shape, it was time to give it more of a prominent edge. To do that, I switched to a low grit sandpaper and sanded by hand, and then moving to a very fine sandpaper and cleaning up the edge. I repeated the process on every single piece, which absolutely destroyed my fingers. I had to pinch the bricks really hard when holding them, and it gave myself blisters. I had to be careful when I was sanding that I didn't sand away too many of the studs, as it still needed to click onto the other pieces. To make sure of that, I tried to leave one row of studs untouched. It was a long and repetitive painful process, but eventually all the straight pieces were done. After that, I still had to tackle the very tip of the sword. That part also took forever, but in the end, I finally had a slick edge across the whole blade and it was ready to cut. This here is something called MEK, methyl ethyl ketone. It technically isn't a glue, but it works like one on LEGO. Basically, this stuff melts the plastic for a few seconds, then hardens again, creating a super solid bond. I'd never worked with it before, so I grabbed a few spare bricks first. I applied MEK, left it for a minute or two, and the bond was so strong I couldn't pull the pieces apart. That gave me the confidence to use it on the sword. I applied MEK to all the connecting surfaces of the sword, carefully, not using too much. While working with this, I had to move fast so then it didn't dry before I connected the pieces. I also had to be careful not to touch the wet pieces because that would smear the plastic. Once everything was in place, I brushed a final layer over the inside to make sure everything was fully covered. I repeated the process on the second half, then attaching all of the sharpened pieces. Now, because I have already sharpened these pieces, I had to be very careful not to get any of the MEK on the edge. If I did, that would just blunten it and melt it away, pretty much just ruining that piece. Once I was all done, my job wasn't over yet. To strengthen it further, I also added extra bricks in the center, the spots where the tang wouldn't sit, because the sword couldn't be hollow, that would make it really weak. Since that works so well, I decided I'd do the same for the handle and the tang. For now, the tang is going to be in segments, and I'm not going to put the wire in until later. One thing I didn't mention earlier is the tang is also going to run through the whole handle into the counterweight. This will make it even stronger, and it also creates a full tang. I have said the word tang way too many times. Oh, and I also finally figured out a way to make the counterweight. Nothing fancy, just a final piece at the bottom of the sword to finish the look, and I think my design was pretty good. With only one step left, I cut the tips of the metal rods off and I finally started to put the sword together. Now, the MEK worked perfectly for gluing the LEGO, but it doesn't bond as well with metal. To attach the rods, I switched to epoxy glue. I started at one end of the blade and worked my way towards the very tip, but the handle and the counterweight just weren't staying on, so I removed them for now until the metal was fully set in place, and then I'd put it back. I spread the epoxy across the metal bar and onto the grooves of each side of the LEGO bricks. I then slid the rods inside. Since I had made so many rods and I had a few spare, I chose the ones that were straightest. I also trimmed them to the right length. I was a little bit concerned that the epoxy and the MEK would mix together and wouldn't cure, but it was too late and I'd already started working with it, so I'm just gonna have to cross my fingers and hope for the best. And once I had all four spread out on the outside and I had the rod on the inside all in place, I reattached the second half of the handle and clamped the metal rods into place with the rubber bands. I then left it to dry for an hour. That's not long enough for the glue to fully cure, but it's going to be enough to move on to the next step. I went back to the MEK and brushed another layer over the blade before sliding the handle into place. Thanks to all the gaps I filled earlier, it was really tight, which is what I wanted. Once it was in, I added more MEK and attached the other half of the blade. I then went around with a brush and gave the connecting pieces a final coating. The counterweight still was giving me trouble, so I grabbed my drill and put a hole in it. I then added more of the epoxy glue onto the metal and slid it on. With that, the build was finally complete and I could let the sword cure for 24 hours, and I called it good. This was definitely an interesting build. If you enjoyed it, make sure you subscribe. I'm trying to hit 10,000 subs by the end of the year. And if you have any ideas of what I should make next, drop it in the comments. Now, onto the fun part, testing the sword. I had a range of items lined up, from apples to oranges and a can of soft drink. But honestly, I was a bit worried how well it was going to hold together. It already felt very fragile, and if you look very closely, I don't know if you can see it, but it was already starting to come apart. Because of that, I'm going to start very light when swinging it and slowly build up the power until it shatters. Each time I hit the apple, I swung it a little bit harder and tried to aim for a fresh spot each time. And it was actually doing some serious damage. By the end, I even managed to slice all the way through. Next up, I wanted something tougher, a can of Coke. And the sword obliterated it. It sprayed me, the blade, and the entire backyard in the process. Then came the orange. This one was a lot squishier, and at one point I even ended up grating the edge with the LEGO studs. But just like the apple, I kept on swinging, and each swing I added more and more power until it did the same thing and cut all the way through. Now, I had ran out of new items, but I still had one more apple. I wanted to swing and see if I could get a clean cut and split it in two. But I didn't hit the dead center, so I tried again, and it worked way better than I expected. So yeah, I guess you can make a sword out of LEGO. The blade held up and stayed sharp, and honestly, it did way better than I thought. What should I build next? Let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, how about you watch me make a sword out of cardboard? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.